Late summer 1945. Eastern Oklahoma. The war is already over, but the land does not know it yet. Barbed wire cuts across open prairie. Beyond it, the sky stretches wide and indifferent, the kind of sky that belongs to peace. Cicadas hum in the heat. U.S. Army trucks idle in the distance, their engines low, patient. Inside the fence, a group of German prisoners stands quietly. Thin shoulders, soft faces, uniforms hanging loose on bodies that are not yet finished growing. Some are 14, others 16. A few have not even shaved. Weeks ago, these boys were carrying rifles in the ruins of Europe. Now they hold mess kits. English words come slowly, learned from guards who speak to them without shouting. They are fed 3 times a day. No one hits them. No one forces them to salute. An order is coming. Everyone knows it. The ships are waiting. Germany is calling them back. But when the moment arrives, when the gates are meant to open outward, something unexpected happens. Several of the boys do not step forward. They stay where they are. And for the first time since the war began, they say no. Their refusal did not begin in Oklahoma. It began years earlier, in a world that taught children how to die before teaching them how to live. Germany did not plan to send boys to war in the beginning. The Third Reich believed it would win too quickly for that. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, the German military was still bound by the restrictions of Versailles. The solution was not only rearmament, but preparation, psychological, ideological, generational. War would not simply be fought by soldiers. It would be carried by an entire people, trained long before the first shot was fired. The Hitler Youth became the foundation of that vision. By the late 1930s, membership was effectively compulsory. Boys as young as 10 were organized, ranked, marched, and instructed. They learned discipline before empathy, obedience before doubt. Physical endurance was praised, but ideological purity mattered more. By 14, they were being trained in weapons handling, fieldcraft, and battlefield loyalty, always framed as duty, never as choice. At first, it was preparation for the future. Then the future arrived early. When war broke out in September 1939, Germany still relied on adult soldiers. The victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries seemed to confirm the system. Blitzkrieg rewarded speed, aggression, and belief. Losses were manageable. The children watched from the sidelines, certain their turn would come later, if at all. That illusion collapsed after 1941. The invasion of the Soviet Union consumed men at a scale Germany had never planned for. Winter, resistance, and industrial war ground down entire divisions. By 1943, after Stalingrad, the Reich no longer spoke of victory with confidence. It spoke of survival. Total war replaced limited ambition. And total war demanded total participation. Teenagers were pulled closer to the front. Hitler Youth units were reorganized into auxiliary formations. 15 and 16-year-olds crewed anti-aircraft guns around German cities. Others dug trenches, manned checkpoints, carried messages under fire. Some were absorbed directly into Waffen, SS divisions, their youth reframed as fanaticism. By 1944, the age barrier effectively collapsed. As Allied forces landed in Normandy and Soviet armies advanced from the east, Germany faced a manpower crisis it could not solve. The Volkssturm was created in desperation, an emergency militia pulling in old men and boys alike. Children were handed Panzerfausts and told to stop tanks. Schoolyards emptied. Classrooms became rubble. Many of the boys sent into combat had never finished school. Some had never fired a weapon outside training. Yet they were placed into collapsing defensive lines, ordered to hold ground that no longer mattered. The ideology that raised them now demanded sacrifice without explanation. Capture followed quickly. On the Western Front, Allied forces advancing through France and into Germany encountered something unexpected: prisoners who looked wrong. Faces too smooth, hands too small, dog tags stamped with birth years that did not belong in a war zone. At first, many American and British soldiers assumed it was deception. Then the documents were checked. The ages confirmed. They were not pretending to be young. They were young. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners of war. It did not clearly account for large numbers of minors taken in uniform. In practice, the Allies processed them the same way as adult POWs, though with growing unease. Medical officers noted malnutrition, stress fractures, untreated wounds. Intelligence officers noted something else: rigid loyalty paired with visible confusion. These boys had been told captivity meant torture. What they encountered instead was order. As the Western Front stabilized and prisoner numbers overwhelmed European holding facilities, the United States activated a solution it had prepared quietly since 1942, transporting POWs across the Atlantic. It reduced pressure on front-line camps. It placed prisoners far from escape routes, and it allowed the U.S. Army to demonstrate strict adherence to international law. By war's end, more than 370,000 German prisoners would be held in the United States. Among them were children. They did not yet know where they were going. They only knew they were leaving Europe behind, leaving the ruins, leaving a homeland already breaking apart under bombing, occupation, and silence. The trains moved west. The ships followed, and far from the shattered cities that created them, these boys were about to encounter a world that did not match anything they had been taught to expect. A world whose first impression would quietly undermine everything they believed and prepare the ground for a decision no one had anticipated. The journey from Europe to America was deliberately unremarkable. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, no declarations of arrival. German prisoners, adults and children alike, were moved as cargo, not as symbols. Transport ships crossed the Atlantic under tight security. The same ocean that had once carried German submarines, now carrying defeated infantrymen in reverse. For many of the boys, it was the first time they had ever seen the sea. They were told little. Uncertainty did most of the work. Upon arrival on the American East Coast, prisoners were processed quickly and sent inland by rail. The destinations were spread across the country: Texas, Arizona, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. The geography mattered. Escape from the American interior was nearly impossible. So was contact with the outside world. Oklahoma was not chosen for symbolism. It was chosen for space. Vast, sparsely populated land allowed the U.S. Army to build large camps quickly. Former training grounds were repurposed. Camp Gruber near Muskogee became one of the largest. Camp Alva and Camp Tonkawa followed, housing thousands of German POWs. By 1944, guard towers rose above open fields. Barbed wire marked clear boundaries. Inside, order replaced chaos. For the boys arriving from Europe, the camps felt unreal. They expected brutality. Instead, they found routine. Prisoners were registered, medically examined, and issued clothing. Meals followed a schedule. The food was simple but sufficient: bread, meat, vegetables, sometimes unfamiliar items like peanut butter. No one starved them. No one demanded ideological statements. Guards enforced discipline, but not revenge. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were entitled to the same rations as American troops. The United States followed this rule carefully. It was policy. It was also demonstration. Officers understood that how prisoners were treated would reflect back on American soldiers held elsewhere. For minors, the system was less precise. Officially, age distinctions existed. In practice, the sheer number of prisoners made separation difficult. Teenage POs were often housed alongside adults from the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe. Some were assigned light labor, farm work, kitchen duty, camp maintenance, tasks meant to keep order rather than punish. What they encountered during these work details was often more destabilizing than confinement. American civilians spoke to them, sometimes cautiously, sometimes kindly. Farmers paid attention to whether a boy looked hungry. Local newspapers reported on German prisoners working fields without panic. Children waved from fences. None of it matched the image of America described by Nazi propaganda. The guards noticed changes quickly. Some of the younger prisoners began asking questions. Not about escape, about school, about American cities, about whether the war was truly over. The rigid certainty that had defined them at capture began to erode, replaced by something quieter. Curiosity mixed with embarrassment. For many, the most powerful shock was the absence of fear. They were not beaten for mistakes. They were not punished for speaking. Religious services were allowed. Educational programs were introduced late in the war. English classes, basic mathematics, even music. The intention was not rehabilitation. It was order. Calm prisoners were easier to manage. But calm created space, and space allowed thought. As 1945 progressed and Germany collapsed, news filtered in slowly. Cities destroyed, families displaced. The Reich dissolved not with a final stand, but with silence. For the boys in Oklahoma, the country they were meant to return to became abstract. A memory fractured by distance and rumor. When Germany formally surrendered in May 1945, the camps did not celebrate. Procedures changed, not emotions. Prisoners were now officially detainees awaiting repatriation. Plans were drafted, ships scheduled. The expectation was clear: everyone would go home. Yet among the youngest prisoners, something unexpected had begun to take shape. They had spent formative months, sometimes more than a year, living under rules that contradicted everything they had been taught about the enemy. They had eaten well while their families starved. They had been treated as humans while the ideology that raised them collapsed into shame. America had not liberated them, but it had disarmed their certainty. By the time repatriation lists were prepared, some of the boys no longer saw Germany as a destination. They saw it as a return to hunger, rubble, and judgment. Oklahoma, for all its fences, had become the first place since childhood where they were not being asked to prove loyalty through sacrifice. The paperwork moved forward regardless. The gates would open soon. And when they did, the boys would be forced to decide what mattered more: birthplace or the first peace they had ever known. That decision would not be made all at once. It would reveal itself through hesitation, resistance, and finally refusal, viewed from many angles at once. Human angle, childhood under uniform. When American medical officers examined the youngest German prisoners, the reports were clinical but unsettling. Below average weight, delayed growth, stress-related exhaustion. These were not men shaped by choice. They were bodies shaped by pressure. Most of the boys had entered military service before understanding what permanence meant. War had not interrupted childhood. It had replaced it. Games were swapped for drills, teachers for commanders. Loyalty became the only language that earned safety. By the time capture came, many could recite doctrine more easily than memories of home. In Oklahoma, the rhythm slowed. Days were predictable, nights were quiet. For the first time in years, nothing demanded heroism. This absence was not empty. It was restorative. Some boys slept excessively. Others began writing letters they never sent. A few stopped speaking for days at a time. The most revealing change was subtle. They began to laugh. Not loudly, not freely, but enough to signal that fear was no longer constant. For children trained to equate suffering with purpose, the realization that life could be calm felt almost suspicious. Yet the calm persisted. That persistence mattered. Psychological angle. Indoctrination without reinforcement. Nazi ideology relied on isolation. It required a controlled environment where alternative narratives were absent or punished. Once that environment disappeared, belief systems weakened rapidly, especially in adolescence. In the camps, there were no banners, no speeches, no racial instruction. Guards did not debate politics. They enforced rules and nothing more. This neutrality, unintended as a strategy, proved devastating to indoctrination. Boys who had been taught that Americans were violent, racially corrupt, and cruel now observed guards who followed procedures and civilians who showed curiosity rather than hatred. The dissonance was immediate. Some reacted with anger, others with confusion, most with silence. Psychological evaluations conducted by U.S. Army personnel in late 1944 and early 1945 noted a pattern among younger prisoners: rapid ideological fatigue. When stripped of constant reinforcement, rigid belief gave way to uncertainty. That uncertainty created vulnerability, not to propaganda, but to reality. For boys raised on absolutes, ambiguity was destabilizing. They began to reassess past experiences not as victories or sacrifices, but as losses they had not been allowed to name. This was not conversion, it was erosion. Moral angle. Humane captivity as an unintended weapon. The United States did not design its POW policy to reshape German identity. Its goal was compliance with international law. But morality, applied consistently, has consequences beyond intention. Guards were instructed to maintain order, not dominance. Punishments existed, but they were measured. Appeals were allowed. Complaints were logged. The system functioned because it was predictable. For adult prisoners, this often produced grudging respect. For children, it produced shock. They had been taught that power expressed itself through cruelty, that enemies revealed themselves through abuse. In Oklahoma, power was procedural, impersonal, calm. It did not demand submission beyond compliance. This distinction mattered deeply. When a boy broke a rule, the response was not violence. It was correction. When he fell ill, he was treated. When he asked a question, it was answered, or politely refused. There was no ideological confrontation, no attempt to humiliate. Over time, this consistency created something the boys had never been allowed to experience: moral comparison. Not between nations, between systems. They began to measure what they had been given against what had been taken from them. The result was not admiration for America. It was disappointment in what had claimed them first. By early 1945, camp officers observed a shift. Younger prisoners were less confrontational, less likely to repeat slogans, less willing to volunteer for ideological activities organized by hardline inmates. They were not becoming American. They were becoming uncertain Germans. That uncertainty did not yet have a direction. It only had momentum. And momentum, once begun, rarely stops at thought alone. It pushes outward into behavior, into resistance, into decisions that reveal themselves only when authority demands obedience one last time. That demand was coming, and when it arrived, it would force the boys, and the system holding them, to confront the meaning of choice, seen through other eyes still watching closely. American Guard angle, watching belief unravel for many U.S. Army guards assigned to German boot camps. Oklahoma was meant to be routine duty. Most had already served overseas. Some had fought through France or the Ardennes. They arrived with their own expectations of the enemy, disciplined, dangerous, ideologically hardened. What they encountered in the camps did not fit the image. The youngest prisoners stood out immediately. They struggled with equipment. They hesitated before speaking. Some asked permission for things that did not require it. Guards noticed the difference not through reports, but through behavior. These were not men hiding their age. They were children wearing a war that no longer fit. Official instructions were clear: treat all prisoners equally. Unofficially, many guards adjusted their tone, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition. A 16-year-old staring at a mess tray did not register as a threat. He registered as a problem created elsewhere. Some guards wrote letters home describing the boys with confusion rather than anger. Others avoided conversation altogether, uncomfortable with the contradiction. A few made quiet efforts to ensure the youngest prisoners were assigned lighter tasks. None of this was policy. It was observation turning into instinct. As repatriation neared, guards began to notice something else. The boys asked about the future, not about Germany, about America. The questions were tentative. Could they study? Could they work? What happened to prisoners who had no home to return to? Guards were not authorized to answer most of this. They redirected. They shrugged. But the questions themselves signaled a shift. The boys were no longer counting days until release. They were measuring outcomes, leadership angle, order, law, and an unexpected complication. From the perspective of U.S. Army leadership, the PW system had worked. There had been no major uprisings. Escape attempts were rare. International observers confirmed compliance with the Geneva Convention. As the war ended, the next phase, repatriation, was meant to be procedural. Prisoners would be returned in stages. Medical cases first, labor units later. Everyone would go home. Then the reports arrived. Camp commanders in several states noted reluctance among underage prisoners when informed of repatriation schedules. At first, it was interpreted as anxiety, then as fear, then in a few documented cases as refusal. This created a legal problem. Prisoners of war were not immigrants. They were not asylum seekers. They were not civilians. They were enemy combatants, regardless of age. The law did not offer a clear mechanism for voluntary non-repatriation, especially for minors whose legal guardians were absent or unknown. Commanders requested guidance. Washington responded cautiously. There was no appetite for precedent. Allowing PLUs to remain could be interpreted as kidnapping by omission, or worse, as propaganda. At the same time, forcibly returning children to a devastated country raised moral concerns the law had not anticipated. The solution, for the moment, was delay. Delays gave time for evaluation. Psychological assessments were ordered. Intelligence officers interviewed the boys, not for information, but for intent. Most were vague. Some were silent. A few were direct. They did not want to go back. German authority angle, fear of return. The fear was not abstract. Post-war Germany was a place of scarcity, judgment, and uncertainty. Cities lay in ruins. Food was rationed. Former soldiers, especially those associated with the Hitler Youth or SS, faced suspicion. Families were displaced. Records were lost. For boys who had left home years earlier, there was no guarantee anyone was waiting. Some had learned, through Red Cross messages or rumors, that their parents were dead. Others feared retribution. not from Allied authorities, but from their own society. The ideology that had raised them was now a liability. Uniforms once praised were now evidence. Returning meant explanation, and explanation required language they had never been taught. In America they were prisoners. In Germany, they would be survivors, expected to justify how they had lived, what they had believed, and what they had done as children carrying adult consequences. The refusal to return was not a rejection of home. It was an inability to imagine it. By mid-1946, the issue could no longer be ignored. The delays had reached their limit. Ships were scheduled. Orders were formalized. Camp gates prepared to open in one direction only. When the moment came, it did not arrive with drama. There were no speeches, no confrontations, just names read from lists, instructions repeated calmly. And then, in the space between obedience and movement, something fractured. A few boys did not step forward. They stood still, and in that stillness, the war's final confrontation began. Not with weapons, but with law, conscience, and a question no one had planned to answer. It was June 1946 when the order finally came. The repatriation ships had been scheduled for weeks. Officials at Camp Gruber, Camp Tonkawa, and Camp Alva read the lists aloud, confirming names, ages, and unit histories. Most of the German prisoners filed quietly. Adults, accustomed to authority, obeyed without question. Many teenagers followed out of habit or fear, but not all. A small group, barely 16, sometimes younger, paused at the threshold of the camp gates. Their uniforms hung loosely. Their faces were thin, pale, haunted by memories of what they had done, what they had survived. For the first time since capture, the choice was theirs. And some refused. The refusal was silent. No shouting, no chaos. Just hesitation that stretched into minutes, each one heavier than the last. Officers approached. Names were repeated. Commands were given firmly. The boys looked at each other. Some stared at the horizon. Some lowered their eyes. None stepped forward. U.S. Army officers were unprepared. Legal advisors had prepared no contingency for minors defying repatriation orders. The Geneva Convention obligated return of prisoners, but it said nothing about children in camps without guardians, who expressed clear unwillingness. The decision now rested not on policy, but on interpretation and morality. Intelligence officers were called. They interviewed the boys individually. Questions were simple. Do you understand you must go home? Do you wish to return to Germany? Answers were hesitant, vague at first, but eventually blunt. No. One boy, age 14, was recorded saying, "I can't go. There is nothing there for me, only ruins." The first reaction among guards was disbelief. Then frustration, then something softer, curiosity. How could children raised to obey unquestioningly resist the most basic order imaginable? Psychological reports noted the unprecedented phenomenon. Years of indoctrination had been stripped away in months of humane treatment and routine life. The boys' choices were logical, not rebellious. Self-preservation, fear of punishment at home, and the experience of dignity abroad created an irresistible calculus. At Camp Gruber, officers held emergency meetings. Other camps reported the same. 50 boys refused collectively, another 20 individually. No violence was authorized. No coercion was attempted. The army had no framework for confrontation beyond observation. Everything depended on negotiation, documentation, and the slow persistence of patience. News of the refusals traveled slowly. Washington was informed. The War Department faced a dilemma: enforce repatriation by force, or respect an emerging principle that children might not be returned against their will when no guardians were present. The political and moral ramifications were immense. It was one of the few instances where military bureaucracy collided with unanticipated humanity. Meanwhile, the boys remained at the gates. Days passed. Ship schedules were postponed. Guards maintained order, but took care not to provoke defiance. The atmosphere was tense yet strangely calm. The American staff, many of whom had fought across Europe, watched children determine the outcome of policy simply by standing still. Within the camps, rumors spread. Teenagers whispered among themselves. Adults watched in silence. Everyone sensed that something historic was unfolding, a small yet profound reversal of war. Here, in Oklahoma, the hierarchy of the defeated was being questioned not by diplomats, generals, or politicians, but by children. The decision was not symbolic, it was practical. By refusing, the boys forced American authorities to confront the reality of their own law, ethics, and power. It also revealed something deeper: indoctrination, no matter how intense, is fragile when not constantly reinforced. And humane treatment, even unintentional, can change the course of obedience. The first step of refusal would soon lead to the second, a confrontation that would involve intelligence, diplomacy, and documentation across thousands of miles. But for now, it was enough to pause, to create space, to make the army reconsider what returning these children truly meant. The quiet tensions stretched across Oklahoma's summer plains. Barbed wire no longer defined their boundaries, uncertainty did. The next stage would test policy, resolve, and the fragile intersection between law and conscience. The situation escalated slowly, measured by meetings, memos, and the quiet deliberation of U.S. Army leadership. By mid-June 1946, intelligence reports confirmed dozens of minors across Oklahoma camps refusing repatriation. Each case was carefully documented: age, unit, capture location, family status, and statements. One 14-year-old at Camp Tonkawa simply refused to board the transport ship. At Camp Alva, two 16-year-olds declared they would rather remain indefinitely than return to Germany. Some cited destruction of cities, others the disappearance of parents. A few could only shake their heads in despair when asked why. Washington faced an unprecedented dilemma. Enforcing repatriation risked international scrutiny and potential trauma for the children. Ignoring it risked accusations of violating treaties and undermining future POW arrangements. Ultimately, the solution chosen was deliberate delay coupled with consultation. Children were allowed to remain temporarily, pending verification of family and guardianship status. It was an uneasy compromise intended to balance law, morality, and practicality. Within the camps, this delay transformed tension into routine. Guards observed more calmly. Children walked freely under supervision, continuing work details, classes, and chores. Yet the refusal persisted. No coercion, no threat of punishment could compel them to step forward. Some prisoners attempted persuasion, warning of starvation or punishment back home. The boys resisted quietly, a testament to both endurance and reason. The refusal sparked international curiosity. Reports filtered back to European authorities, particularly the U.S. military government in Germany. Official correspondence noted concern. Minors refusing repatriation could complicate reconstruction efforts and create political embarrassment. German officials, many still steeped in remnants of Nazi bureaucracy, were unprepared for children exercising what Americans termed free will. It was a phenomenon the war had never intended to allow. Observers noted several factors influencing the boys' decisions: survival instincts. Germany was devastated, homes destroyed, food scarce. Returning could mean starvation. Psychological recalibration. Months of humane treatment had rewritten expectations of authority and obedience. Alienation from ideology. With Nazi Germany defeated, the belief system that justified their service was crumbling. Moral clarity. For the first time, actions and consequences were consistent. No arbitrary punishment. No ideological manipulation. These elements converged at the camp gates. The defiance was not loud or theatrical. It was the quiet insistence on a choice denied in Europe, demanded by ideology and only now possible. Army psychologists reported in July 1946 that the phenomenon was unique. Similar cases in Europe had involved coercion, escape, or repatriation. But nowhere had so many minors resisted returning voluntarily after extended exposure to humane treatment. The finding was as unsettling as it was illuminating. Authority without morality may enforce obedience, but morality without coercion could undermine years of indoctrination in weeks. Eventually, an agreement was reached. Children whose families could be traced were returned with oversight. Those whose parents were dead, missing, or unable to care for them were temporarily retained under U.S. guardianship or assigned to post-war labor programs in safe locations. Records from Camp Gruber note that several boys requested permanent residence in the United States, a request largely ignored but quietly noted by officials for future administrative purposes. The gates opened eventually. Some stepped through, others did not. The refusal had set precedent, creating a space where choice, even for children trained to obey without question, could be acknowledged. It forced military and civilian authorities alike to confront the unintended consequences of humane treatment and the fragility of ideological indoctrination. By the summer's end, the story was recorded in reports, letters, and camp logs. Historians would later find the incident obscure, but at the time, it represented a profound moral and psychological turning point. In Oklahoma, a group of boys had quietly resisted the final demand of a war they had barely survived. Their defiance was measured, silent, and decisive, a climax not of combat, but of conscience. And as the summer cicadas droned over the plains, the boys remained in a strange in-between, no longer soldiers, not yet citizens, and unwilling to return to the ruins of a home that had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The aftermath, in both Germany and America, would ripple far beyond the camp fences. The war had ended, but its echoes lingered long after the last ship left port. In the immediate months following the refusal, U.S. Army officials faced a dual task: comply with international law while addressing the unprecedented resistance of underage POWs. The camps shifted from temporary holding facilities to quasi-guardianship institutions, where the youngest prisoners were monitored, educated, and sometimes placed in supervised labor programs. Their daily routines resembled those of earlier months, but the tension of choice remained, an invisible line stretching across the prairies of Oklahoma. For many boys, life stabilized in ways they had never known. They attended English lessons, continued camp chores, and in some cases, were allowed supervised excursions to nearby towns. Records indicate that a handful of teenagers formed bonds with local families, their interactions often cautious but mutual. Civilians noted the quiet transformation, fear replaced by curiosity, suspicion replaced by tentative trust. Repatriation proceeded selectively. Boys with living parents, verified homes, or clear guardianship obligations were eventually returned to Europe. Many faced the ruins of post-war Germany, cities flattened by bombing, infrastructure destroyed, and family networks shattered. Some were reunited with parents, others discovered that relatives had perished or disappeared. Letters from these returning miners reveal a mixture of relief, grief, and profound disorientation. The world they remembered was gone. The world they had left behind had not waited. Others remained temporarily in U.S. custody, their continued presence a moral compromise. The War Department had no legal authority to prevent return indefinitely, but practical solutions, such as assigning them to labor programs or educational placements, allowed them to remain under supervision until arrangements could be made. These boys lived in a strange limbo, neither fully free nor fully captive, their days structured yet undefined. Throughout this period, the U.S. Army carefully documented behavior. Reports consistently noted that the boys' discipline improved, that ideological rigidity diminished, and that compliance with camp regulations was higher than before. American officers saw firsthand how humane treatment had reshaped perception and behavior. It was not propaganda, it was observable fact. For some historians, these months would later become the clearest demonstration that authority without cruelty could achieve stability while simultaneously undermining previous loyalty. Meanwhile, adult POWs often observed these developments with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. They recognized that the children's refusal was not an act of rebellion in the traditional sense. It was an exercise in survival and judgment. Older prisoners rarely intervened, though some cautioned their juniors against defiance, fearing repercussions or moral judgment. The result was a subtle divide. Age no longer dictated rank, and obedience no longer guaranteed safety. For a brief moment, the camps were transformed into microcosms of post-war reconstruction, where authority, morality, and choice collided quietly but decisively. The boys' resistance also generated discussions at higher levels. Washington debated the implications, how to balance law, morality, and public perception. International observers, primarily from the Red Cross, monitored camp conditions. Reports emphasized that the United States had fully complied with the Geneva Convention, yet they quietly acknowledged the anomaly. Children refusing repatriation against both legal expectation and parental authority. The social effects inside the camps were equally profound. Teenagers who refused repatriation formed informal networks, supporting one another through uncertainty. They shared stories of home and war, of loss and fear, of hopes that were fragile but undeniable. These interactions reinforced the realization that authority could be navigated, not merely endured. They had discovered agency within a system designed to contain it. By late 1946, the immediate crisis of refusal had subsided. Ships had departed, paperwork had been filed, and remaining boys were integrated into supervised programs, some for months longer. The event, though quietly contained, had lasting implications. It challenged assumptions about indoctrination, obedience, and the moral responsibilities of captors toward minors. The Oklahoma camps had not just held prisoners. They had witnessed the first voluntary resistance of child soldiers outside the battlefield. A turning point measured not in bullets, but in conscience. The broader consequences of the Oklahoma refusals unfolded slowly, reaching across continents and echoing into post-war reconstruction. For the boys who returned to Germany, life was harsh. Cities lay in ruins, farms were abandoned, and the infrastructure of daily existence had collapsed. Food shortages were severe, housing was scarce, and displaced families struggled to survive. Many former child soldiers discovered that their parents had perished in bombings or displacement. Those who survived often faced scrutiny from local authorities and community members, suspicious of their time in military service. Former Hitler Youth affiliation and combat experience marked them as outsiders, even among fellow Germans. Letters and reports reveal that many experienced profound dislocation, caught between a past of indoctrination and a future without guidance. For those who remained longer in the United States, the experience created a different trajectory. Temporary guardianship programs, supervised work assignments, and educational opportunities offered stability previously unknown. Some older teenagers were integrated into American agricultural programs or vocational training initiatives, helping rebuild post-war labor shortages while learning skills that would sustain them in adulthood. Documentation from Camp Gruber notes that a small minority expressed interest in staying in the U.S. permanently, a request rarely granted officially, but quietly acknowledged by officials aware of the boys' unique situation. The event left its mark on U.S. military policy. While the refusal was rare, it demonstrated that humane treatment could not only maintain order, but also alter behavior and allegiance. Officers and psychologists observed that ideological indoctrination, even when intense, could be weakened in months through consistent, respectful treatment. The Oklahoma camps became an unofficial case, studying the relationship between discipline, morality, and obedience, influencing discussions in military and academic circles about the treatment of minors in conflict zones. Internationally, the episode was largely forgotten. The Red Cross and U.S. diplomatic channels documented compliance with the Geneva Convention, but the moral and psychological nuance, the children's conscious refusal to return, received little attention. In Germany, post-war rebuilding overshadowed the story, and most local records failed to capture the experience of underage POWs. As a result, the narrative of German child soldiers in Oklahoma remained obscure, recorded only in camp logs, military correspondence, and the occasional memoir of survivors or American guards. Yet the psychological and moral impact persisted. Among the boys themselves, memories of humane treatment contrasted sharply with earlier experiences of violence, deprivation, and indoctrination. The lessons endured. Authority could be exercised without cruelty, obedience was not inevitable, and choice, even for children trained to obey, could be claimed when the circumstances allowed. Historians examining the phenomenon later concluded that the refusal highlighted a broader truth about war. The most rigid systems of control are fragile when confronted with human dignity and consistency. The Oklahoma camps, intended as temporary holding facilities, became unintended laboratories of moral and psychological insight. By the time the last shipments departed and the camps closed, the boys, some returned, some temporarily retained, had irrevocably altered the assumptions surrounding child soldiers, captivity, and repatriation. Their quiet defiance had shifted policy, influenced American understanding of the Geneva Convention's application, and revealed that even in the aftermath of total war, the human capacity for agency could not be fully suppressed. From Oklahoma's sun-baked plains to the rubble-strewn streets of post-war Germany, the consequences of their choices rippled outward. They would go on to live with the knowledge that their moment of refusal had been witnessed, recorded, and quietly respected, a rare victory of conscience in the shadow of a global conflict. In the end, the story of the German child soldiers in Oklahoma is not measured in battles won or territories taken. It is measured in moments of choice, quiet acts of conscience, and the fragile power of humanity in the aftermath of destruction. These boys were trained to obey, to sacrifice, to believe without question. Yet far from the ruins of their homeland, under the wide skies of Oklahoma, They discovered a space where obedience was no longer demanded. The calm routine, humane treatment, and consistency of the camps offered them something the war could not: the ability to pause, to reflect, and ultimately to choose. That choice, the refusal to return to Germany, was not rebellion in the dramatic sense. It was a measured, deeply human assertion of agency. History often remembers wars in terms of generals, strategies, and battles. But here, in the silent tension of Oklahoma's Purdue camps, the decisive moment was moral, not martial. The boys' refusal highlighted the limits of indoctrination, the resilience of human conscience, and the unforeseen consequences of mercy. In their hesitation and eventual decision, one sees a profound truth: that the structures of authority, no matter how absolute they appear, cannot entirely erase the innate human desire for dignity and safety. The consequences extended beyond the camp fences. They forced U.S. authorities to navigate legal, ethical, and psychological questions that had no precedent. They left Germany with a generation of miners struggling to reconcile indoctrination, trauma, and survival. And they left the boys themselves with an indelible lesson that freedom, even when constrained by circumstance, can emerge in the quietest, most unexpected ways. For historians, psychologists, and ethicists, the Oklahoma episode remains a rare lens into the intersection of childhood, war, and morality. It reminds us that even in total war, where lives are measured in strategy and statistics, the human heart can assert itself. Sometimes, the most profound victories are not those of armies or nations, but of conscience, exercised in silence, under the open sky, and against the weight of a world that once demanded unquestioning obedience. In that quiet refusal, the boys were just children, yet their choice resonated far beyond childhood. They were witnesses, survivors, and moral agents, proof that even in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction, humanity can persist quietly and decisively.